Someday I'll figure out how to do this. Okay, we're live. This is our weekly basic income discussion group. I'm Alex Howlett. I actually had a request from someone online that I introduce myself. And everyone introduced themselves just now, but if you want to introduce yourself again, you can. You don't have to. But people on the live stream at least want to know who I am. I'm Alex Howlett. I host these discussions. This week we're talking about corporate monopolies, and this was actually a topic that Madeleine suggested to me a few weeks ago, and she's written a blog post about it too. So we did have an optional reading for this week, which is an article that basically summarizes some of the key points from Tim Wu's recent book, The Curse of Bigness, where he talks about the dangers of corporate monopolies and what to do about it. So I imagine that Madeleine has a lot to say about this topic. So certainly, as much as she wants to speak, we're going to be excited about that. And I want to start with a question. The question this time, in addition to general thoughts about monopolies, the question I have is, if something makes sense to most efficiently be implemented centrally through a single kind of coordinated system, what's the best way to do that? Is a monopoly sometimes the right answer? And if a monopoly is not the right answer, what are some other answers you can think of? And why are monopolies bad? When are they bad? And are they ever okay? So I guess all of those questions to kind of get us started.
Can you summarize those questions again?
Yeah, so I mean, there are some things in our economy for which it makes sense to have kind of like centralized production. Like that's the most efficient thing, to have it all be done through one process by one entity. So what are kind of the options there for implementing that that maybe don't have some of the disadvantages that we usually associate with monopolies, that kind of thing? So do you want to start us off?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit tricky to answer that without knowing more of the details about why it's efficient to do it in that way, because there might be different options depending. I guess I'll start with like some general pros and cons of both. Did you also bring that up in your question?
Sure. Yeah.
So, I mean, I think the advantage of monopoly is avoiding redundancy. That's like one of the main advantages. So that could include something really extreme, like avoiding the redundancy of like multiple power lines or like multiple systems of internet, or it could be just avoiding redundant work, which of course if you have competition, people are usually not sharing their work or sharing their information with their competitors, so that means you have people probably producing redundant work. And then the advantage of competition would be that you have an incentive to increase quality and decrease price for consumers. That's just not there in a monopoly. So how can you get some of those benefits when you have to have a monopoly? I'd have to think more about that. I think it's interesting. I think it might depend a little bit on like the kind of situation, but you could certainly have people bid at the beginning for like what is going to happen, and maybe have like good contracts set up. If it's not the kind of thing where you have to have like power lines that last for many decades, you could have a rebid. So I guess I'd have to know like a little bit more about what the details are before I kind of try to construct a creative solution there.
Yeah.
Don't you need to make a distinction between natural monopolies, like water distribution, and monopolies in the marketplace?
Yeah.
So maybe it would be different in the two different sectors, which is positive and which is negative. But I think in the context of his book, I don't think he's talking about natural monopolies at all. He's just talking about the negative aspects of monopolies in the marketplace, companies.
Okay. Pablo?
Yeah, I support a view. I think marketplace monopolies are, especially now when in this age, so we're all business students, and we taught like a lot about how do we deal with competition, how do we win market share. But then when you talk about Amazon now, I think I've been talking with my professors, and I think that there should be a different course, like how do you deal with Amazon? Because this is one company which is literally getting everywhere, and and they're fundamentally changing, the phenomenon of like competitive advantage, the risk associated with any sort of business, and with the amount of data Amazon has, it can essentially remove the risk. The amount of the preciseness of the forecasts they can make on consumer behavior with the amount of data they have is remarkable, and that removes a lot of risk for them. So they are changing capitalism in a sort of way which, I mean, we were having discussion on the walk here. So you're saying that should we, like, we're both, advocates for, like, liberal market, but then again, this one company and the likes of it, like Facebook, Google, they can change it in a way that which would be hurtful. Like, I mean, we want perfect competition, but then these phenomena, which are very new, think there needs to be some sort of study done on them and the effect they can have on the larger economy.
Yes, I guess pretty much we were talking on the way in. It was kind of a long walk,
Yeah.
and basically, I think we came to a question that was, should we stop, and how to deal with it? We have no idea. Like, historically, we never had anything like this. Those big corporations. It's not that I know of. And
What about Standard Oil? He actually mentioned that in the video, that was optional while watching or whatever, if you want to go more in depth into it. And well, in China, there's a lot more data, and there's I think it's like Baidu or something like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
And there's far more consumers and things like that. So if Baidu goes international, it would be a direct competitor to Amazon. And so there isn't really necessary to break up Amazon.
The thing is that they have the data Amazon has. It's like the consumers of Amazon. Like, Amazon has its interest in online shopping. They have interest in the stuff you're watching online.
They also have what is it? Cloud computing. That's where they get most of their income. I watched the video about
Cloud
that.
computing is more of an
So-
enterprise solution, but
We
when
should
you-
Sounds like there's
Yeah.
a lot of really interesting stuff to discuss here, but I want to get everyone's initial thoughts before we get into the group discussion. So, Sultan?
I read the article.
Yeah.
It's obvious these big companies, they are becoming monopolies. This is too dangerous. Even I learned that, and even they don't hide it. When you use the domain relentless.com, it directs Amazon. Maybe you know. Relentless.com. I checked it. It's true.
Did someone set that up as a
It's
joke?
probably some
They
trolling.
bought the domain. They were using it before, I believe. I don't know. So I don't have clue how basic income will be helpful about it. I don't know. Yeah, that's it for now.
Okay. Nick?
Yeah, I guess I'm with Bethany that I think that different situations are different, and you have to. I mean, I think if you're going to have a monopoly, then you have to have appropriate amount of regulation that we have for our utilities, and even there, I think there's a big. I feel like that's a big downside. The amount of regulation is what's being very green.
Okay. Richard?
Well, the way I think of fixing a monopoly would be to have multiple political parties that would challenge each other to have the best ideas, and you can do that with like a parliamentary system and ranked choice voting. And so you had that, it would fix a lot of the issues. Like right now we have a two-party system pretty much in America, and for businesses, they're not that, for the business side of things, they're not particularly different about it. They both receive money from Wall Street and whatnot, and so they're compromised in that regard. And They're
So
not
we-
going to change how. They're not going to break up. Use the antitrust laws to break
I
up
see.
the monopolies.
I see. Jared.
To get back to sort of what a monopoly is, I think the thesis I would like to posit at the moment is there is no such thing as a natural monopoly, or rather everything is. That naturally competition by definition is inefficiency. It means getting at least two people to do one person's job. And that the thing that we're starting to notice with places like Amazon that you brought up is that what used to be a little inefficiency is becoming major inefficiency as our technology, our ability to exploit what otherwise would be a very efficient system, a very free sort of flow of information, becomes clouded between either logistics or patent rights or God knows what else. But I would say everything is a natural monopoly, and so this question of what do you do with monopolies, is important, maybe even more important than I think we're realizing. I think everything is in this category.
Okay.
I would say monopolies, like, I find it more of an incentive structures on every company has an incentive to make most profit for itself. And if you don't get to the point where you change that incentive structure, it's gonna be like the market is gonna end up at monopoly. Like if a company has profit motive and they know if they acquire whatever other companies are out there in the same sector, they would just basically buy them out and jack up the prices just because they can make more money that way, or increase the barrier to entry in that sector, like million other things that they can do. So I would say there has to be some way to change those incentive structures, either be like some sort of regulation or like breaking up companies if they have certain market share. I mean, there can be like a lot of parameters that you can do it by, but yes, I think it's not inherently bad because economies of scale do save you money, but then you have to. It is only beneficial if the end consumer is having any benefits.
Okay. Well, these are great comments. Jacqueline on the live stream says, an example of a monopoly that benefited people was the public utility Bell telephone. I remember those days. Phones were property of Bell, and the monthly bill was cheaper than after Bell was broken up. Not to date myself, but I remember having what was known as a two-party line, which played a prominent role in the Seinfeld episode that Bethany and I watched last night.
It's true.
Yeah. So I really liked what Madeleine said about natural monopolies, and then Jared kind of stole my response, because that's basically along the lines of what I was going to say, is that competition is by definition, multiple people kind of do, it's redundancy.
Right,
multiple people doing the same work, and Bethany said that too. So yeah. Sorry, I was still setting things up when Bethany was talking. So yeah. But I would also say that it's a continuum, right? So depending on what industry we're talking about, depending on what market we're talking about, sometimes competition is more inefficient than in other cases. So I think there are benefits to competition, and then you kind of have to look and ask, well, when are these benefits outweighing the costs of the redundancy? And if the costs of the redundancy get too high, then what do we do? And I think that's normally where economists kind of draw the line between what's a natural monopoly and what's not. The natural monopolies are where the competition just isn't worth it anymore. The costs of the competition just aren't worth it. So that can be a debate in itself. What qualifies and what doesn't. And I think as Pablo was pointing out, and as Jared was pointing out, like Amazon and the efficiency that they generate, they're changing where that line is, because the benefits to kind of like the centralized single producer have now increased. So now should we consider Amazon and companies like Amazon to be a natural monopoly now, even though they weren't in the past? Yeah, Bethany.
Well, one thing that seems to be the case with Amazon is that like they aren't quite yet a monopoly because they have at least one major competitor for everything that they do, which, you know, is sort of one of those compromises where you have like one major competitor, so it's not like many companies doing redundant things and you have some economy of scale, but you also have some, you know, motive to keep price down and quality up. I think that's true for most of what Amazon does. Like you've mentioned that Walmart has like a pretty big online store, and so you can kind of some people still do go there, and I guess that's like a threat to their online shopping. And then other places have media like Hulu and Netflix are not owned by Amazon, right?
But
I don't think the concern is what Amazon has now. I think the concern
Where
is
it's
what
going.
they might go to, and I don't think their competition is other online stores. I think their competition is like the entirety of American commerce.
Interesting.
Like they're not trying to replace online stores; they're trying to replace stores.
Right.
and
Well,
again,
yeah.
Amazon is. You can't just say Amazon is a monopoly. Amazon is a monopoly in multiple sectors and not in other multiple sectors. It's not just pigeonholed into one sector.
Right.
So that would be a big question: where they are a monopoly and how would you define, like, what would you define as a monopoly?
Right. And Alex, was your point like, do we think that the inefficiency outweighs the benefits in the case of like something like Amazon? Like, is that kind of part of your question?
Yeah, so I guess the question is, when you look at a big company like Amazon that's controlling so much of a few different markets, is the best course of action to break up Amazon, or is it to nationalize Amazon, to maybe have more government involvement so that it's managed for the benefit of the people, that kind of
I
thing?
mean,
I
Madeleine.
want to say that I don't think we're talking about the same thing. When I say natural monopoly, it's
Yeah.
more like I think what it means is that when one company comes in and let's say builds an entire infrastructure for water in a city or state, that's what I mean by that, because it takes so much money to build that infrastructure that it's almost guaranteed that they will have the monopoly over the distribution of water in that area, because it would cost so. I mean, they're there, and so.
I think what we're saying is that Amazon is sort of turning that into the case with retail. Like,
Right,
it's taking so much resources to be able to compete on the same level as a larger competitor now.
Yeah.
That you may as well be competing over water infrastructure, even for something simple like selling
Right, but
DVDs.
it didn't start out as that way. It
Right.
started very small, and so did all these other, tech companies. So there is a difference there, I think.
Yeah, Richard.
I think in the movie, in the video, he mentioned how, like cable, it cost them like $3 a month, but they charge like $60 or more, and well, you could easily just have one company do that because they're just going to set up fiber optic cables everywhere, and they share all these different companies. They use the same fiber optic cables. And another thing you can do is with socialized medicine. They just still, all these different companies. They all these different insurance companies. They're not breaking. They charge out outrageous
Premiums?
yes, premiums, and all these deductibles. You have to spend at least $5,000 before they even kick in. Not a lot of people spend $5,000 on health insurance, and those who do don't really get enough of a benefit from it.
And I think you bring up a good point, Richard, which is that certain parts of a business can be natural monopolies while other parts aren't. So maybe, the fiber itself, you wouldn't have, one wouldn't have multiple sets of fiber going to each town or something like that. But maybe you do want competition over allocating that fiber, and have different service providers that are all using the same infrastructure. So you can kind of break it down that way instead of like focusing on the individual companies. You can focus on the various services and
Right.
how much redundancy makes sense and that
that's,
kind of thing.
Yeah.
that's what net neutrality is all about.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
He actually mentions that in his article.
Yeah,
He actually coined the term.
net neutrality.
Net
Tim Wu,
neutrality.
the guy who wrote this book. Yeah. Pablo, yeah.
Yeah, actually, like when you're talking about like a company being monopoly in certain segments and being non-monopoly, it's actually discussed in 0 to 1. So Peter Thiel was talking about how like when you see Google, you see, okay, there's this company doing like they're into software, they're into search, they're into mobile phones, they have their own line. But when you look at their revenue, about 60 or 70% of it comes through search and ad revenues. So when you look at it, these companies diversify to look like, hey, you know what, we're in so much segment, we're not a monopoly here, but then you look like Google is a monopoly in search. Amazon is an online marketplace monopoly. Microsoft is PC like software monopoly. And these companies like often diversify to avoid regulation. Like if you're just doing search and you like, own a lot of market share, so then that attracts a lot of negative government attention. It's seen as a strategy for them to define themselves as a more broader, like serving more broader segments. But if you look at a microscope, then you see like where exactly they're tilting the supply demand chains.
Yeah. So I want to get to some of the comments on here because they've been going pretty strong. So Jacqueline says, with privatization of the whole planet, I think we need to return to the idea of public utilities with price controls and bring more things under that umbrella. And I think that's an interesting point, and that brings up the question of when should things be nationalized and publicly regulated, and when should they be left up to the markets?
Well, there's the middle road.
The middle road. Well, that's
not make it public, but regulate.
Right.
It still can be.
Yeah. So there's everything in between. And then my mom said, "Why would you want Amazon to break up or be nationally controlled?"
Right, because you said that.
Right, and I guess the danger is that if you if Amazon is not acting in the interests of the people, or they are maybe taking risks that you don't want them to take, like if we become dependent on Amazon as a society, it's not okay if Amazon fails, because then everyone suffers. So now you've got this thing that everybody depends on, but it's kind of being managed by a for-profit private entity.
Can I ask you, is there an industry or a company that you don't think that holds for?
Yeah, I mean,
I don't feel like that even really holds for Amazon yet. Like,
it holds true in case of their web services. So there was this weird incident in 2016 or 17.
oh, because people have their data stored there.
Yeah, there's this one network engineer, he screwed up. So what happened was that companies like Spotify and Netflix, a whole bunch of other companies, they lost internet, like their networks were shut down. Now, I mean, if you talk about Netflix, people are watching a lot of data. Netflix is consuming a lot of data in American cyberspace. Netflix is just one of the customers of Amazon Web Services. Actually, like a lot of Spotify, Netflix, these are really like data-heavy companies. They are dependent on Amazon Web Services. We're looking at a lot of these companies, like a lot of our cyber apps, they're dependent on Amazon Web Services, or they screw up. I mean, we saw it, like how many of them suffered. It was a temporary loss, like their servers shut down for a few hours, but then again, we see how broad the web service network is.
And it's estimated in that few hours of loss, the cost to all the customers was in the I want to say hundreds of millions.
I don't know the economics of it, but yeah, we do see the scale of dependency.
So it seems. Oh, sorry, were we going back to these?
Oh, go ahead.
It just seems like, I guess, one option to try to maintain some of the efficiency and still have some of the benefits of incentivizing better prices and better quality is like having a low barrier to entry, which isn't always maybe possible to maintain, but like in terms of where regulations might want to target things, like if it's possible to have other companies be able to form relatively quickly and compete, like should the price go up too much or should the quality go down?
I think
Seems like that helps.
Amazon's not. I think it's not the barrier to entry. It's the user base. Once you have managed that, plus the technology that they have built over the years.
Right.
It's not like I can open a store and compete with that just because plus the economies of scale as well, of course. So it's way more difficult to do that rather than and you can't just force like a private company to share their.
So why
their
is
private
Amazon
data.
still like relatively cheap and customer friendly? Like it's presumably because they still have some good competition, like with Walmart and
So
stuff. or-
Amazon is fascinating. Amazon has a net loss for their retail
Yes.
service.
Yeah.
It has always
Really?
had a net.
Because they're shockingly
At no
cheap.
point in
Yeah.
Amazon's
They have
history
never made
have they
money.
ever made
They've
money
never
selling
made
anyone
money
anything.
yet.
Right.
Amazon Web Services is extremely profitable. They make a ton of money
Yeah.
with that. The actual retail service has been operating at a net loss since it
loss
was
leader.
created.
So is this just like a quirk?
It's
Like, or
a
what is
market
going
grab.
on?
It's yeah, they're
You're trying to capture all the market share until there's no competitor left, and that's
Yeah.
all your market now.
Oh, I see.
That's
So
really-
that's what we're concerned about.
but also
yeah.
it's stock driven. So the decisions in Amazon are made by shareholders who own
right.
Amazon stock. That stock is more valuable the more market they control. They don't really care about profit. The stock doesn't actually pay dividends. They just care about their share price going
That's
up.
interesting. That's
Not only that, but they also control, for instance, their publication division. They have so much control over which publishers can sell on Amazon. So that kind of thing, the effects, the negative effects of a monopoly goes way beyond, making things cheaper or more expensive
Right.
for the customer. They control just too much.
Speaking of a
of the
natural
market.
monopoly, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Yeah, how would you compete for the service of having all products in one place, which is part of the service that Amazon provides, right? Like I can go to one place and shop for a bunch of things at once and like search all the different products in the world practically.
But
How do you do that unless you're big, right?
Yeah, so it's interesting because Amazon has all this infrastructure. If you know
Right.
there's a really high barrier to
I guess that's what
entry
you were saying.
for actually competing directly with Amazon and everything they do. And
Right.
they have all these data centers, they have all this software and everything, and and infrastructure, warehouses and whatnot. It's hard to compete with that. But on the flip side of the coin, the services that Amazon provides, the web services and all of that, they reduce the barrier of entry to a lot of forms of businesses that are now able to use those very simple services that were not available before.
That's true. Yeah.
So you've got kind of Amazon kind of controlling its own marketplace, and then within that marketplace, it's very easy for people to kind of come and go.
Yep.
So there's kind of two levels of
On the
of
flip
this.
side
Yeah.
of that, they'll charge you cut off that whatever your sales are.
Right.
And then there were stories on. I've read stories on somebody selling their products. The data is still owned by Amazon, and the moment they realize they can do it for cheaper, they can just crowd you out of the
Yeah.
market. So I've read stories on. There were regulations introduced recently in India that any online marketplaces cannot sell their own products in competition of the other. So
That's
you
interesting.
cannot have a stake in the company whoever is selling on your marketplace. You're
Right.
just the owner of marketplace. You cannot invest in companies that you're selling from.
That's
And that's a
interesting.
big hit for at least for the online companies, but I think it makes it more.
Doesn't that kind of, like we were talking about economies of scale before, doesn't that basically kill your economy of scale? Like the thesis of Amazon retail is they can provide things cheaper, more efficiently because
Yes.
they control the data and they control the marketplace. It's at least for the moment until it becomes a monopoly and we get jacked up prices. At least for the moment, it actually does make people's life easier.
Right. The point there would be, I would say, you would still get the benefit of that supply chain management system of there, but you would miss that. You might miss that economies of scale. You would still get the same service.
I think the economy of scale is the service. I think that's what.
But he's just saying that Amazon couldn't like make their own dishwasher or whatever, right?
Yeah.
And sell it.
Sell
on
their
there.
own batteries.
So they're
Yeah,
still
very
providing
Amazon
like the
feature.
economy of marketplace scale, just not dishwasher
Yeah,
production
I
scale.
don't think the
Is that
marketplace scale is the
speaking to
benefit of
anything?
Amazon. I think the production and
Oh, you think
distribution
it's the
scale
production.
is where they're actually generating value.
So let's go to Sultan.
I think the most dangerous thing is, I believe everybody heard about that Jeff Bezos' personal relationship thing.
Yeah.
Somebody offered to Jeff Bezos to buy that media that blackmailed him.
Oh,
That's
the
only
So
Inquirer.
they can have huge effect on media for buying by buying them, so they can even affect political things.
Sorry, was that, did Amazon buy that? I thought Bezos
They
personally.
didn't buy,
They didn't
but
buy
when they were trying to find a solution for that thing, somebody offered to, I think it is your friend's brother or something, offered to buy that media.
It was one of the solutions they come up with to like kill the story.
Right.
They didn't buy it.
Yeah.
But it was a
On
Yeah.
the table. Yeah.
alternative, I mean.
So are private corporations easier to kind of influence and coerce than maybe a government managed
Right.
program?
Or they can also buy
yeah,
media
public.
outlets.
And you can buy in one day
Right.
that huge money.
I think the biggest monopoly of Amazon is the data. Like Richard mentioned, like in China, all companies have to give access to the data to the government. In case of Amazon, now Amazon just doesn't have like. Firstly, let's say that most of the businesses that run on very principal phenomena of risk, and that risk, like a lot of companies use different methods to reduce risk. One of them is forecasting, which is based on historical data. Now, Amazon has data in multiple, like you won't believe how many kind of data they have. And now, when you use technologies like machine learning, you can make like radically predictive forecasts, and you can make a lot of accurate predictions about consumer behavior. So that reduces the risk. And the monopoly is on engagement, on users, on data. For example, I'm going to mention one case of Facebook, or Instagram, and Snapchat. So I guess back in 2016 or 15, Facebook offered to buy Snapchat. They gave an offer about like north of $10 million. Even Spiegel refused the offer. 2016, Instagram launches the principal feature of Snapchat, which was the stories. Now, stories was the competitive advantage of Snapchat. As soon as Instagram launched the story feature, the growth dropped for Snapchat by more than 80%. The amount of, the rate at which they're acquiring new users, they dropped by 80%. Engagement, the biggest factor by which we measure these apps, which is the daily active users, that also dropped. And now I saw a recent report by the Business Insider, like of all the apps using stories, which is now Facebook has stories, now WhatsApp has stories, Messenger has stories, Instagram of course. Of all this total share of stories, Instagram had 60%. Meanwhile, Snapchat, who started, is now again dropped down. So this says that how like instead of a price war, they can do like a user war. When you have a lot of user base, you can stop a lot of people from competing. Like if you launch a new product in mobility, Uber likes it. They can copy your competitive advantage and they can scale it across so quickly.
Right.
So that is the new challenge of businesses we're facing right now.
So
But doesn't Facebook own Instagram?
Yeah, yes, it does. That's why they introduced it in Instagram, and they introduced the same feature in WhatsApp, which also is owned by Facebook.
yeah, so basically Facebook couldn't buy Snapchat, so instead they just copied them,
Right.
or they didn't want to pay any more than what they offered, so they're like, because they knew they could do it themselves. Yeah. So a question is this a problem? Is this a bad thing? Features are getting implemented for consumers. That sounds good to me as a consumer.
Right. I mean, I guess
yeah.
what people are worried about is like what's to come. Like,
Right.
so I suppose like if I knew more history, that would be really hopeful. Like what happened in the 1800s. But there were these like phenomena whereby things would be good for a bit because they would like lower prices to get rid of competition, if I remember my history well, and then like raise the price after that.
Right.
For example, the railroads, I think.
But
did
shouldn't
this.
we ultimately think about the people who work for these companies and who all the companies that disappear, and therefore people lose their jobs and
Well.
So that's a great question because it brings us to the topic of basic income, which we haven't really mentioned yet.
Right.
right. So
you walked right into it.
so no, I mean it's important. To what extent are workers, citizens of the company they work for? To what extent should people be taken care of by employers rather than, say, the government? And ultimately, do we care about the well-being of workers, or do we care about the well-being of all consumers? So I mean, like, this is the question. And if everybody, you know, had a basic income and people were able to get the most out of, you know, what the economy was capable of producing, then would we care whether people had jobs or how much they're being paid at their job or how well their employer's treating them and stuff like that? If they have, you know, if they have the option to say no and just live their lives and have decent lives. So yeah.
Well,
Go
can
ahead,
I
Madeleine.
say?
Yeah.
I read an article about the tech companies, you know, Facebook and Google. They actually like the idea of a universal basic income because it's not a positive comment. It means, according to this article, is that if people have enough money to buy services that are produced by a monopoly, ultimately the money that you give these people, these consumers, goes back to these monopolies. And in the meantime, we are reduced, the consumer and the employee, to just being a consumer. And
So
it just, sorry, but this article points to the fact that we're really diminishing a person's freedom by just giving them money to buy stuff.
I have to say I disagree in the sense that if what you're doing is creating inefficiencies so that people have to do work to get their money, like that seems a lot less free than just giving people the money to me. And if you're keeping competition, or if you're keeping away certain companies just for the sake of creating that ability to work, you see what I mean? Then you're just kind of making it work for people to do.
Well, I don't quite follow. According to this article, the reason that these tech companies are for a UBI is because it's a minimum way of keeping the consumer being a consumer. So, and it doesn't go at the cost of their profit, really. Because it comes from the government, they probably would never pay for it. And it also reduces the standing of the consumer.
What do you mean
I
by
guess that's the
reduces
part
the
I'm
standing of
confused
the
about.
consumer?
Well,
So before you say that, everything sounds really good. Like
Yeah.
the businesses profit more and they're providing services for the consumer and the consumer is benefiting. Like all of that sounds good. But
Well,
when you say it reduces the standing of the consumer,
Not
what does
the,
that
the,
mean?
the power, I would say, if I assume that monopolies are often bad for the workers and the employers because it can dictate the salary that they pay to their workers because they are monopolies, so there's really not much competition to worry about.
Well, there's a difference between competition in terms of competing with other businesses to sell things to consumers and then being, you know, kind of the only employer in town, right? So that's kind of like a monopsony on employment.
Right.
You're the only one doing hiring.
There's also non-compete contracts so that you can't, if you get out of quit a company or whatever, you can't go to their competitor because and there's like I think it was a few years ago they had all the tech companies they wouldn't poach or whatever employees from each other, so that kept wages down, and there's things like that.
Yeah. So
Interesting.
yeah, I mean, the question is it a problem if an employer is paying their employees very little? In a world with a basic income where you can just decide not to work and go live your life, then maybe they're not paying you enough to go do the thing you wouldn't ordinarily do with your
doing
time.
it right now. So
Yeah.
one of the reasons why they're so like efficient in skills because they pay their employees really low. And actually, like if you notice, like we had a case study in one of our courses for the finance subject. It was on the culture of Amazon.
Yeah.
So they have this system called Flywheel. Right. And so Amazon, like it's one of the most innovative companies, and but also has the highest turnaround of employees because they get stressed, they get burned out so fast. Now they're gonna make small teams. So Amazon is basically like a collection of startups. They're gonna keep a small team, They're going to work. They're going to have all the departments in one, like they call it atom. They call it atomic teams. Now, and their job is to find a solution for a problem and then automate it. And that's another like structure of business. So Amazon treats its workers like robots. Like there were literally cases where they had to pee in a bottle. They wouldn't leave the desk. They would pee in a bottle, and they would. If you're taking leaves, your colleagues would criticize you a lot. And this created a lot of burn among employees, and they left. Like the turnaround rate for Amazon is like less than a year.
But presumably, it's still worth it to Amazon to do this.
Yeah, the idea is that it's joked around like one of the people said that Jeff Bezos has hired a guy, like they have a chain of people who are trying to fire the other guy. Like there's a guy who's researching on software, like working on algorithm which can make fire these 50 people. There's another guy who's working on software which will fire these 50 people, until the link goes all the way back to Jeff Bezos.
Yeah.
And that explains why, because they're running on a really thin margin. They're running on a really thin margin. Sometimes, like in case of their grocery, because this is running on loss. They're running on like 3% loss. So if the average margin on grocery is 3%, you're giving 5% discount. You're at 2% loss. So I mean that's the price. We argue that's the price Amazon pays for your data. But if you notice the thin margins and the absolute shit state of employees, you can see that they're going towards an automation model, but they have a long line of talented people ready to burn themselves.
So I think we can all agree that nobody should have to live their life in that way. But the question is this a problem with Amazon, or is it a problem that we're living in a society where people are going to work at Amazon because the alternative is even worse? Right.
Google and Facebook, like if you notice the average pay, the median salary in Facebook is above $100,000. Same case for Google, and their employee management programs are better. They care a lot about the workers, but Amazon is different. Amazon says that it's a customer first company, and one way it's really ironic, because if you look at the marketplace, it's moving towards perfect competition. You search T-shirt, you'll find 500 different sellers. You know the price,
right.
You know the reviews, you have all the information about the sellers.
Yeah.
Amazon can negotiate really good terms. So their job is to, Amazon has like a lot of power with these sellers.
Right.
Yeah.
They can, force them to sell their items at really low prices.
Mm-hmm.
And when I search for a book, I notice that all the cheapest ones have like a 1 cent price difference from each other, because they're all trying to like
that is an incredible
sale.
service actually.
Yeah.
Wow.
So
I guess going back to the actual question on, like, let's say there is universal basic income.
Yeah.
Does that make sense in that terms if there is a monopoly? I would say in that case, I would think you would still want to see where the money is going. You still wouldn't want like very few people having the lion's share of the profit on the basis of just because there's somebody making the product as well, right? You would want to make sure that it's not the like CEO gobbling up all the profit and everybody under them is not. So
Why?
You would want why? Okay.
Well, why is it bad for the CEO to gobble up all the profit? If Jeff Bezos was just like, he had superpowers and he was able to like do everything on his own.
Right. So I guess where that comes from is like, would you trust one person with all the resources?
Right.
Yeah.
So I think
That's what it comes down to.
I think that's a big part of the issue. It's about, you've got the service that consumers are depending on, and if you've got one single point of failure, then so that's where you want to look into redundancy or regulation or nationalization or that kind of thing.
Yeah, and Jacqueline's just to include the people on the web is also worried about accountability. When you're too big to kind of when people are so dependent on.
So Jacqueline says the reason Amazon is a problem is because they're not just too big to fail; they're too big to be held to any kind of public accountability for anything they do. So that's interesting. Do we think that that's true? Do we think that that Amazon is too big to be held to public accountability, or do we think that maybe they?
I think it's because of the data laws. I think there needs to be some sort of taxation on the data they're collecting.
Taxation on the data they're collecting.
There needs to be some
Data
restriction.
dividend.
Yes.
Data dividend.
So
Yes, with the
I'm against that. Especially nowadays, people tend to make data people demonize. They think that they are devil. This is not the case always. I mean, mostly they do good things. So,
yeah. So, the question is, what would a tax on data be? Are you
for data,
measuring
Like
megabytes or
in
gigabytes?
European
Or
Union, for example,
Yeah.
it is illegal for Facebook cannot combine data from Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp. They cannot. If you do that, you have a really like interesting and powerful data set. You can create a really good profile of a customer. Now, if you look at Amazon, you have Alexa. Alexa is sold at a loss, but it is essentially a data gathering device. So now you're having your tracking like a lot of stuff, a lot of random stuff. You're also tracking their buying behavior, and you're also buying their, studying the behaviors and like a lot of these different consumer items and groceries and clothing and all that. You're also studying their content choices through Amazon Prime Video and IMDb. Now this creates a very strong customer profile,
Yeah.
and it's like really easy to nudge customers. And but there's some ethical question, like how exactly, how far can you collect the data, and can you combine them?
Why is that an
so
ethical
should we also do,
Allow.
get tax from the academics? They also use people's data.
What sense, like?
I mean, the academic people.
Yeah, biologists, sociologists, they
Everybody uses
Board with-
data.
I guess what he's trying to say is, for a company like Amazon, having that profile, they can advertise certain products. It becomes to the point of, I guess it comes to the point of, is there free will, or is it just because you're buying certain product, that because something is in
Yeah,
front
for
of you?
Facebook, if you're willing to pay $11 for a year, you can use it without they use your data.
Really?
If you want to pay it, I mean,
I guess my question is, why is this a bad thing? We're talking about companies being able to accurately find what I want before I know that I want it and give it to me. That's amazing. That's a kind of luxury nobody's known before in history.
well,
I
there are-
agree with you, yeah.
But then again, that's the rosiest view that you can have, right?
There are risks
And
to.
you have
This-
your
this-
own judgment. If you don't want to buy something,
Yeah,
Exactly.
That's,
That's the point.
So, do we think it's a good thing that Facebook is not allowed to combine their data from their different services in Europe? Is that something that's better for consumers?
Maybe not for consumers, but I mean, to what end is it going to be used?
exactly.
And that's a very dangerous
Yes,
prospect.
that's what I was going to get at. The thing about Facebook and Amazon is they're trying to get it for a profit, but with scientists and sociologists and things like that, they're trying to use it for research, and they're not using it for profit. They're trying to better mankind, if you will.
None of this was ever private to begin with. That's what bothers me about. So I actually work in data science. This is my daily life. But what bothers me about this is none of this was ever private to begin with. We always used to have this data. In the 1800s, if you went to the general store and bought a fish, the guy you bought it from knew you bought it because, of course, he did, because he operates the store. The only thing that's changing is we've essentially developed computerized Sherlock Holmes that can say, oh, I deduced by the grass stain on your jeans that you went through this airport and this day.
But
and even
there's a
for
big difference there.
automation, we have to use data for automation.
Yes, but there's a big difference there. My grocery store owner didn't know what else I was doing outside the grocery store.
They
And-
could. There was never a
You
law
can still
stopping
hire
them
a
from going
private-
talking to your neighbors.
Yeah, but there
you
wasn't
can
the
still hire-
technology.
Yeah, you can still hire a private investigator and keep on me for a whole day, but that's not the same thing.
So
right?
so a lot of stuff has gotten easier, right? And this is kind of a big deal because the scale and depth of the ability to process data.
Right.
I mean, like they didn't have machine learning 200 years ago, right? They didn't have the kind of data analytics that we have today, and the volume of data collection, right? So I mean, like, I think I probably agree with you that it's a good thing that we're able to use data more efficiently, et cetera, et cetera. That's a very powerful thing. But I think, as some people are rightly pointing out, when you have that power, you got to make sure that it's being used responsibly for the benefit of everyone.
I'm not arguing that there's not more power. My
Yeah.
only point is like I feel like there's this mentality that like, oh, I don't want Facebook to know like my home address or like what.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Then
there's-
don't use it.
from a-
Simply that.
There are people who are scared of like personal information that always used to be there, right? I used to be able to look in a phone book and find people's personal addresses.
Right.
Yeah, but
Absolutely.
and by the way, these days it's much more difficult to find somebody's phone number. Because in the past I got that white page. Today, but just yesterday, I forgot, was it on the radio or I read something about the data they collect. They said that even if you don't have a Facebook account, but you purchased or somehow acquired some apps that were developed by Facebook, Facebook gets access to everything. As an example, I apologize if somebody finds it inappropriate. They said that Facebook knows when women's periods are coming. It can be detected by the information about what kind of products they buy. Of course, but it's like if they know that I like green socks with red dots, I'm happy that they deliver it to me. But some information they get access even without my knowledge, even if I don't have an account. That was the issue.
And also, I believe that if you take into consideration this whole combining data thing, like I'm from Brazil, and the only way I communicate with my family is WhatsApp. It's like my life. And I don't know until what point they have access to my conversations and what I'm saying. And if they can combine that with Facebook, Instagram, and if I have Alexa, they have a profile of you that goes way beyond of what kind of socks you like. And they know what time you go to bed, what time you wake up, your sleeping habits, your eating habits. And I think that it's a lot of, maybe they can force some things into you. Or maybe they can use that.
But there's also the risk of, I don't want to sound like a doomsday person, but do you know why the Jews were almost totally exterminated in Holland as opposed to some of the other European countries? It was because the Dutch census was so incredibly well organized that they immediately knew where the Jews were, where they lived, which...
Then what is our policy? Are we against censuses? Are we against intelligence? Are we against
I think
being
what
able
my
to know
point
things?
was that
Or-
Amazon has too much data, like they have an unfair advantage when it comes to data. Other companies will find really tough to compete because the amount of data they have, they can predict with a lot of certainties.
Then I would suggest the solution isn't less data but more. I would suggest the solution isn't, well, let's try to cripple Facebook because that hurts everyone. I would suggest the solution is let's try to make sure that everybody has access to the same data.
Yeah, but then
It's basically equalizing the
yeah,
level of playing field.
yeah, you level the playing field because right now it's really tough to compete with companies like Amazon, specifically because they may argue that the user-generated data is theirs.
And again, the other issue is, what if I don't want to give my data? Like it used to be in initial days of internet, like you can use a lot of
I
services.
don't think you own your data. I don't know why you would own your data. I'm seeing you right now. I know what you look like. I didn't pay you to know what you look
Yes,
like. I just
yes.
do
I
myself.
think
Yeah,
one of the
this is-
things.
this is
I
public
think one of the
space, though.
differences that happens is like we are like culturally evolved, genetically evolved to be sensitive to cues of observability in that way. Like we know when the fishmonger is there. We might not say certain things. We might not do certain things, right? Like we have that sensitivity intuitively, and so I think part of what upsets people about sort of realizing when it gets pointed out to them that this other data might be being collected is like in everyday life we feel anonymous on our phone, or like we feel anonymous on our computer, and it's hard to adjust and feel like those same intuitive sort of responses to being observed. Do you see what I mean?
Don't change the technology, change the culture.
Well, but that isn't so easy to do overnight. I'm just saying, why is this dissonance happening? Like people are saying, oh, like I feel like I'm just having this private conversation with my family, but I actually don't know to what degree it's being observed. Unlike when I go into the fish market and I kind of know, and there are cues, and like I'm easily able to respond to those cues, right?
But I think what you said is important, that if everybody had access to that data, then there wouldn't be a problem. And that goes back to the problem of a monopoly. And so in terms of the UBI, maybe, have you heard the term UBA, like Universal
Basic assets. Yeah.
So that would be an example of everybody sharing that one asset that Amazon has now and sharing it with everybody else.
Another case I would like to talk about is like when autonomous vehicles. So when a company, for example, a manufacturer like Tesla, they've been in the game longer than anyone else because they have capabilities to collect data. Now they have more data and they can train the algorithms better than all other manufacturers. But if they don't share these algorithms with their competitors, these manufacturers might be losing out and having some algorithms which are safer. It's in general interest, like if autonomous vehicles all have a safe algorithm, like if Tesla has the best, like safest algorithm in the market, and they decide not to share it with other manufacturers, I mean, that's like one of the cases where owning the data is unethical. Like it would be better for the rest of the community if all the data was made public.
This is basically like getting into the patents issue that you've talked about a lot. Like it's kind of an intellectual property.
Interestingly, Tesla has shared all of their patents with everyone.
Really?
Yeah, they just haven't shared
Not
their
the
data.
data.
Yeah.
So,
But a couple of years ago, there was a special discussion on patents. And there was like a lawyer involved in it. He said that actually companies, big companies, monopolies, we say, they accumulated like hundreds of thousands of patents. And this is the issue. A monopoly can suppress development of new technology. Like Amazon, after all, is just a distribution company. But the production, it's a different story. If like Polaroid used to make those cameras and somebody came up with the idea of a digital camera, they would buy that patent or somehow, let's say they bought the patent, put it in their drawer, and that's it forever. It never happens. A new camera is not such a big deal, but even my green socks may be a big deal because if somebody invented like a new fabric, like something which affects something else, that's the issue.
Yeah, intellectual property, copyrights, and patents are very interesting examples of monopolies.
Yeah, that's true.
Because you have a copyright or you have a patent, then nobody else can use that information
For a while.
for a while. Yeah.
Yeah, like Scott Sanson's had an idea for funding a basic income about how you can start out at $10 per year, and it doubles each year. It's like then 20, then 40, and then after like I think it's like 16 years or something like that, it's like $1 billion for the.
Yeah.
No, it won't happen.
I feel like that
Because
would cause some problems.
People won't be able, but
Is this related to intellectual property?
That's for like patents, and that's the way you can fund the basic income. So after a while, the patent doesn't become they're considered worth paying for the patent, and so it becomes goes into the public domain.
I'm not sure I understand. What does the doubling of the basic income every year have to do?
No, the doubling of the basic income is some of the renewing the patent or the copyright.
I think he's talking about the fact that the legal term of a patent has extended year after year.
Yeah, it's
for a
like
while.
95 years for a copyright now.
Right.
And in a few years, Disney's probably going to renew Mickey Mouse's patent.
They actually didn't. That was this year, and this was the first time they didn't do it. And now Mickey Mouse.
No, it's not Mickey Mouse. They could renew it in 2024. This year is for like a bunch of different books. Like you posted that Smithsonian article.
Right. Okay. All right. Well, we'll see. But yeah, I mean, it's also interesting because Jacqueline on here was talking about making money from her book. Jacqueline and my mom are both authors, and my mom doesn't make any money off her books really because she's a poet, and poetry doesn't make money. But Jacqueline was feeling really like she should be able to earn a living from this kind of intellectual property that she was creating. So this is someone who's saying, hey, I want a monopoly on this thing. Now, I don't know if you guys know this, but the first time I ever thought of something like basic income, I was thinking about patents and copyrights. And I was thinking, well, what if we eliminated all patents and copyrights so that you couldn't really sell anything you wrote anymore, anything you invented anymore. You'd have to actually these things are what they call non-rival, and that you can share them, and you still have the original person still has the information. It's not like a car where you steal a car and the other person doesn't have a car anymore. But yeah, so what happens when you eliminate that stuff? Well, the economy still has the capacity to produce everything it was producing before, including the information and intellectual property and all of that. But now some of the consumers have lost their source of income. Some businesses have lost their source of income too. But we know the economy has the capacity to respond to the level of consumer spending that it had before. So that's when I thought, well, there's got to be a way to get people money. So that was kind of the logic that I followed to get to the idea of a basic income. And I think that's true of jobs in general. And we kind of have these artificial, or these laws that create artificial markets for things that there wouldn't be a market for intellectual property if we didn't have intellectual property laws. Like, this is all artificial. And other things that are kind of similar to that is that we have labor policies, we have economic policy that's designed to create jobs, and we have minimum wage and stuff like that. Would we really need any of that if people were otherwise able to spend all of the money that the economy was capable of productively responding to? So I know we're talking about monopolies. Yeah, but it's as far as information goes, I think it's a great idea to have more shared information. I don't think it's impossible to say, hey, you need all your secrets to be public at all times, but it can become easy to identify, a company like Amazon that's generating all this data and keeping it private and making a profit off of that. And you can target these companies and say, okay, let's make this open. And if you've got something else in addition to that provides an additional benefit that you want to use to have a competitive advantage, then sure. But getting a competitive advantage in this way feels like it's something that's inefficient for the economy, even if you do have monopolies,
But
even
do
if the
you
monopoly
think
is
that
more
the private
efficient.
citizen would be able to struggle with Amazon, like Amazon, if all the information is available?
Yeah.
Imagine. Still, I don't believe that I would be able to fight with them. And you know how in the past, like in the 15th, 16th century, in mathematics, you know how they protected there. That somebody found a way of solving like the fourth order algebraic equations. He would send letters to some other people who he knows that they, with an anagram or some quotation from something which somehow it's like a cipher. It indicates that he has a solution, but he doesn't say what the solution is. How he would benefit from that? Eventually, it will become known that that guy knows how to solve, because they would have contests. They would be some university would hire that guy rather than the other guy. That's how they would make that. But the intellectual property, they would kind of how do we say it? Like they would cipher it, like so it's
Encrypt it.
Encrypt. Yeah. So everybody knows that you have something, but nobody knows what exactly you have.
I want to get back to
Yeah.
this copyright idea of use. Let's say a painter has devoted 10 years of his life to create a work of art.
Yeah.
He doesn't get paid for it because, he's not employed by anybody.
Sure.
So if he doesn't have the copyright on this, then those 10 years have been not wasted, but he hasn't gotten anything in return.
He doesn't get any money. Yeah.
Right. So the copyright guarantees that at least he will get paid for
But
these
he
10
will-
years.
It doesn't. It doesn't guarantee that at all. I mean, everything's copyrighted, and most people don't want to buy, a painting. Like it's not.
It's
Yeah.
a ownership right.
That's not a
Yeah.
good example, because you cannot produce the same painting before the original painting has been completed.
No, what I'm saying is
Yeah.
you cannot sell that painting
Why
without.
not? Like the emperor or
So-
whoever is reaching
So
out.
Without
let's
giving
let's
the
say it's not a
order-
painting. Let's say it's a digital image that he created.
Those
Okay.
are different
Yeah.
things. That's the point.
But I think the point that Madeleine's trying to make would apply to a piece of digital art, correct?
Yes, or
Yeah.
photography. My
Okay,
mother,
yeah.
I mean, she spent
Yeah.
her life making photographs, and they are all copyrighted. And if one of them is being published or being made money off of,
Yeah.
then she is entitled to.
So is that
Percentage.
is that a good thing?
Well, so are
I
you,
think
you
so,
never seem
because-
worried
Yeah.
about like people's
That's how we
motivation
grew
to
up.
create, but I imagine somebody could disagree with you.
People's motivation to create.
Yeah, so like you don't ever seem to worry that people's motivation to create will drop on
No.
average.
Well, I don't think
Without
people should
copyright,
need to be able to sell something to create to be motivated to create, and that not just from like a pure like, oh, I am an artist. This is what I do. But I think if we look at like the rise of things like GoFundMe or Patreon, I think patron-based models actually work better for most artists, and they've seen a massive development away from like big record labels and music to independent producers, and I would argue better, faster iterated art typically.
The concern
Well,
I
all I'm
always
saying
have-
is
Yeah.
that because of this copyright business, she was able to feed her family. So
Well,
The system
so
works
so
for
then
you,
the
that doesn't
question
mean it's
so
a
then the
good
question
system.
is, does the fact that she had to feed her family using copyrights does that mean that copyrights are good, or does it mean that something else about the economy is broken, right? So basically, you've created this kind of exclusive monopoly on this information that she holds, and there's no physical reason why it couldn't be freely distributed. But we've kind of created this market where she can make money that way. So is it a good thing that she can make money that way? I don't know if the answer is yes.
So what about the concern that
Yeah.
George was raising? Like
Yeah.
people will hide their information even more. without
People, so
copyright?
this is what I was talking about before about secrets, and that includes trade secrets and all of that. And
Right.
it's easy to hide secrets. It's easy to hide, a lot of things. But like I was saying before, a company like Amazon, they have a lot of data, and you might not. If you're the government, you might say, "Hey, Amazon, you got to share your data, or you are going to have this penalty." And Amazon can say, "No, we're not going to share this data," but then Amazon gets shut down, right? Like, so then there's like the incentives. Like, if you're just a mathematician participating in a competition, like there's no reason really why the government would sanction you, or what kind of leverage would they really have over you, right? Whereas if you're a business and you're making all this money and people can tell that you're making this money off these secrets, they can compel you to release the secrets. That's not to say that Amazon can't hold other secrets, in terms
That's
of
like
how
a
they
whole
use the
nother
data or
step,
something
though.
like that.
I don't know how
Yeah.
I feel about this whole chain. I have
But
to think
then
about
again,
it.
I guess
Yeah.
what you're going to is a place where universal basic income exists. So my question on that would be,
Yeah.
should a company work for money? Like, why are... So if
Sure.
the owner cannot earn money as in like doesn't have any ownership rights, and the companies don't, in that instance, it totally becomes... It's not a money-driven economy, I would say.
So, hold on, I think that's an interesting idea. I don't think that's what you're talking about. You're just talking about intellectual property, right? Not stock ownership.
Right.
The
And
owner would still make a profit in manufacturing industries by stock ownership. They would still own the company, the profits of the company.
Yes, but if the owner doesn't own anything, as in like intellectual property
Yeah.
or like ownership of certain rights on certain things, eventually it comes down to whoever, like only the people who are executing stuff are making money. And even then,
yeah.
the argument there was, let's say I don't own, there is no copyrights,
Yeah.
and I don't get paid for whatever I create. Let's say.
Right.
So in that instance, whoever is reselling that is making money.
Nobody's reselling it because nobody can make money because it's freely available, right?
Right, but then that's the caveat I was talking
So
about.
maybe someone's providing a service that that curates, stuff because there's so much stuff out there, and then you pay that person for like finding the good stuff for you or something like that. You also, like Jared was saying, you might have a patron-based model where instead of people paying for something that's already been created, you might be like, I really want to see a movie, about such and such or blah, 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 and you get like your crowdfunding campaign together and something like that.
Are we still talking about intellectual property, or are we talking about property generally at this point?
Intellectual property. So property in general, certain goods are rival with each other. Like if, Bethany has a car and I take her car, now I have the car and she doesn't have it anymore, And those types of goods, you're gonna trade ownership with each other, right? Whereas, does it make sense to trade ownership of something that can be freely copied?
Okay. I see
Go
what
ahead,
you're
Richard. Yeah.
My cousin and his fiance or wife, they have this, I guess you'd call it a band. It goes with the Moon and You, and it's bluegrass, and they like do tours and things, and they sell tickets. They even go to like the Netherlands, and they go to Nashville and things like that, and they have concerts, and they just sell the tickets, and they sell like shirts and things, and that's how they make their income.
Yeah.
So you don't need to have all these like record labels and things to sell their music and things. Like they put out free samples of their music on the internet, and then they have the people come to them and to their concerts and watch them or listen to them or whatever.
Yeah. So I think there's kind of two questions here. One question is, how do people make money? And then the second question is, how do we ensure that all the cool stuff that's being made in our market economy still gets made?
Yeah.
And the first question, the answer is, you don't need people to make money. The only reason to pay someone would be to incentivize them to do something or something like that. So you don't have to worry about that as long as you have a basic income. And then the second question is, I think kind of what we were getting at here, which is, if you can't make money off art, are people going to be artists? If you can't make money off patents, are people going to invent things? Yeah.
And there's kind of like two parts of that. There's the individual motivation, but there's also things that take expense to make, like we talked about, like blockbuster movies and things like this. And the concern I have about like the Patreon model is that in theory, I imagine, like given also the wealth gap that we have in our country, I don't see why you might not have a larger percentage of like big expensive blockbuster movies run by like whatever the wealthiest billionaire wants to make.
Research, have public grant money.
Sorry.
So do what we do for like scientific research.
You
have
could do
public
that.
grant
Yeah,
money.
you could.
We used to have a public endowment for the arts that would give out art funding.
But I'm
for
thinking
people
like
that
the Marvel
died
movies or
this
something,
year,
like the
but-
things people want to see that are like really popular. Right now
Yeah.
they're driven by like many people buying a $15 ticket, but like if you don't have that,
Yeah.
You can have a Netflix model. Like you pay per month for Netflix, and then Netflix puts out the content that people want to watch, and so.
but if people could freely copy it, then maybe Netflix wouldn't be making money off of it anymore.
Yeah, so then you have kind of a tragedy of the commons problem where, people know that Netflix is going to put out the stuff, so you just watch it when they put it out, and you don't actually have to pay to get it made. I think what Bethany is saying is that the people who are actually going to put in money to pay to have things made are maybe the really, really rich people, and they might have an agenda or something
They
like
might
that.
have an agenda, or they're just
Yeah.
not reflecting the preferences of everybody, or some combination
Right.
of that. It seems
Yeah.
more efficient to reflect preferences with each person paying.
Right.
In
Then
some sense.
have public funding for this sort of thing. Have like when
How do you decide what to fund though? Like everybody paying with their dollars is such an efficient way to decide what people actually want to see.
I'm not sure it is. I don't think it does tell you what people
I
want
mean,
to see.
you
It tells
could-
you what people are willing to see. How
I mean-
many times have you gone to a movie because you really wanted to see that movie, and how many times have you gone to a movie because that's what's on and it seems like the best thing the theater is
There
playing?
are so many things
We
to
usually
watch. Are you kidding?
only go see movies because we want to see that
Yeah.
movie, to be honest.
I don't know.
yeah.
I mean, it just seems like it would be really hard to guess from like with a public funding model, like what to make, in the same way that consumers can drive what to make.
So there's public funding, but that doesn't mean that it has to be public decision. It doesn't have to be decided by the government or that agency.
Right.
It could still be, you could have like a voting system where people can,
And I
express
think,
what they want to
there's a
see.
fallacy with
Yeah,
this,
that's
because
true.
people like under the model right now when Hollywood makes a movie, they go through the same process of pitching it to some board of people who are going to fund it, right? It's just that board of people are
But
private
that
sector
board
versus public.
is trying to predict like what all these different people are going to pay money
Right.
for, and then they can use the data of what all the people paid money for and like fold
You
that
could
back
do
So
the same thing in
in.
the public sector, just with what people saw versus what they paid for, right?
Well,
Right.
Holland has subsidizes most of their art.
Yeah.
They just have a fund, and you say, okay, you make a mural in the library, or you do that, and so.
In the Soviet Union, everything was subsidized. And it looks like the solution to the whole problem is everything must be monopolized, and there is a central organization which plans everything.
So we talked
And
about
by
that
the
last
way,
time.
who will suffer first? Women, of course.
Right.
Because in terms of, say, clothing, men are happy with sweatpants and t-shirts. That's it. But women need lots of other stuff. And if it has been planned that this year or for the next 5 years, all dresses or skirts are green, they will be green. And it doesn't matter if you like blue. You know?
Yeah, so I mean, there's the problem
that's not
of
the case in Holland. They
not
don't tell
the
you
case.
what to draw or what to paint.
Right. Yeah, and I think there's a difference between saying you've got subsidized art or subsidized industries and saying like it's all centrally planned and it's kind of like directed from the top down. I think you can certainly have a model where people are able to do a variety of different things and make their own choices and stuff like that, and still have it be subsidized by the government. And I mean, basic income, of course, is like the ultimate example of that, because you have all consumer spending is being subsidized by the government, and then it's up to the market to decide what to produce for people, and that's going to be determined by what people's preferences are. So it's top-down funding, but it's the opposite of top-down planning.
Alex,
Yeah.
just want to remember again,
Yeah.
I did it already some time ago. When you say about subsidizing by the government,
Yeah.
don't forget, the government has no money of its own. It only redistributes taxes. And so it's not as much about the government as the cultural level of the society. If the society is interested in painting, then eventually they will get how it is called, the national endowment for the arts.
Yeah.
If society doesn't give it them, there will be no such a thing. So it's how the society
Well,
needs
it's
those
a two-way
things.
street. I
Well,
mean, if the government stimulates the arts, then that's one thing. I mean,
no. It happened in the Soviet Union. Believe me, they
But the
stimulated
Soviet
only
Union doesn't
very.
necessarily
Huh?
like the Soviet Union was an example. It is not the be-all and end-all of every possible study
So-
of government programs.
So I think it's always the case that the government is responding to the demands of the people, and the people are responding to whatever restrictions and constraints are imposed by the government. And it's always kind of like a system that kind of goes in every direction, and there's incentives and everything coming from everywhere. So it's not as simple to say that the government is kind of operating independently and centrally planning stuff. I mean, they're responding. Like even in the example of green dresses, the government thought that people wanted green dresses, and they were just really inefficient and made people wear green dresses long after the time when they didn't want to wear them anymore and stuff like that.
But I guess that's an example
yeah.
of like something you don't want monopolized, since we're talking about monopolies, is
Yeah.
like trying to guess at all the consumer preferences, because that is way better driven by just, I don't know if that's really a monopoly, but it's way
Yeah.
better driven by like people making their own decisions and that aggregating
Yeah.
than it is by somebody trying to predict,
But
even
it's
like the
already
most
planned.
altruistic
It's either planned by a retailer who's deciding what they think they can sell, or it's planned by a government that's deciding what they think people will take.
But then it has
Yeah,
to-
but
plan.
But
the
the
retailer, collectively, the markets have more information than kind of the government would have. In order to model the markets, you'd have to.
Why would you like the government? The government knows how many dresses people are acquiring the same way that the retailer knows how many dresses people are acquiring. They know what they
No,
have
they,
in
but
stock.
they don't. Well, go ahead.
They don't necessarily know, how to make. They don't necessarily know how to put themselves in the position of the business and to do what would be the most profitable thing for that business, as if they were that business. You know what I mean?
Why wouldn't they?
Because that's one
Well,
entity trying to do
so-
that for like all these different.
So okay, so here's the
Well, so
answer.
the
They
government
might.
isn't
So
one entity. We have-
Jared, they might know this if you live in a world where all the businesses are operating profitably and the markets are functioning. But as soon as you try to replace the markets with some kind of central planning, then they lose that data. They lose that price data.
So sorry, what are you calling central planning? Are we thinking like a guy doing this, or are we because
It can be an
the
algorithm.
government is not? Well, what I mean is
Yeah.
the government is not a central entity.
It can be a
there are
committee,
city
it could be-
governments, there
yeah,
are
sure.
regional governments, there are state governments, there is a federal government. There's
All I'm saying is that I don't think it would be feasible for anything other than a market to do a lot of the things that the market does. And you could analyze the markets and understand the markets, but as soon as you take the markets away, you're losing data. You're losing that information. You're losing consumer preferences. You don't know what the consumer preferences are anymore.
Can I give you an example
Yeah.
of at least one industry in this country where absolutely everything from production to labor to supply to use of products is entirely centrally planned? The
Sure.
military.
Yeah.
And granted, the military has a lot of differences between itself and other industries.
Yeah, I have to say I feel like that gives me zero insight so far, but you might be right, because it just seems like the goals are totally different, and it probably isn't matching like the aggregate of a whole bunch of different people's preferences as well as like a market.
Well,
But
the
it
military
also has to be centralized for a whole bunch of reasons.
the military is also doing something very specific, right?
Yeah,
They know what their objectives are to defend the country, that kind of thing.
Well,
Whereas
defend the country is a very, very broad objective.
it's a very broad
Like,
objective, but
everybody from cybersecurity analysts to people with
But it
guns.
has
sure,
to be like
sure.
a unified
But
body.
when you think
Also-
about the markets, it's about producing things for consumers based on consumer preferences, and that's
Right.
something that's very different from the way the defense industry works.
Oh, but
Yeah.
like with the defense industry, they're fighting the last war. They don't have the technology like 20 years ago. They didn't want drones, but representatives forced them to develop drones, and now they're heavily dependent on drones. Or
So you're saying that the
they don't actually.
the military
they
is
have
technologically
always
defined.
known what they want, and
Yeah.
there's like they're they're
Go-
corrupt, and they want they give preferences to the companies that like there's a revolving door of contractors and things like that.
So I think you're right that there's an argument to be made that the military actually is pretty inefficient in some ways.
Go read like an RIFBAA and tell me that you still think the military doesn't have an eye to the future. Go study what the documents from the Pentagon releases on our doctrines. Go look into the NGCB program coming out of the Army. Go
And
look
DARPA and things.
Even DARPA.
There are many programs within the government whose job is to do exactly the opposite of what you're saying, whose job is to look at not just the next war, but the war after the next war.
But it
and
just
be ready
seems like
for
this
it.
isn't that relevant to consumer
Right.
spending. Like
Can
I
I-
think the military
Yeah.
has like very specific goals. There are very few of them. It's not. It can't really split into a bunch of pieces where you can make a bunch of green shirts, red shirts, short shirts, long shirts. You know, like it's for all these different consumers. So you don't need. You're not trying to match all this data, right? You're not trying to understand.
You definitely are.
I don't see.
The
it.
military
no.
consumes very different resources in different parts of its operations, right? The Air Force does not consume the same resources that the Army does.
But I mean, the
Air
ultimate
Force,
goals are like have to be central goals in a way. Like there have to be a coordinated strategy of like a few, like a relatively
Shouldn't society
specific
have a
number.
coordinated strategy?
No, for people that things that people are wearing, not at all. Like it should be, you match all the different preferences that people have, right? It's a totally different thing.
I
No,
guess
the
what he's
military
trying to
is
say
more
is
concerned about closing than many others.
Well, that'd be
I
the
guess what
husband.
he's trying to say is basically like if a private entity has the same data as the government, can government make the same decisions as the private entity?
Right.
Which is a doable thing, I would say. It's not like out of the realm of
Well,
possibility.
the private agencies are like, to me, the process wouldn't. I don't see how the process
It's a
would
process,
change. Right
exactly.
now, a private entity has a paid analyst whose a salaried employee whose job is to predict what sales will look like and try to give them useful.
But each
actionable
one is only
insights.
doing like a tiny piece of the puzzle. So I guess maybe you'd have to make something
So each
like
agency
that
and government would only
complicated.
do a tiny piece of the
It's
puzzle.
the same thing as like if both of the like private entity or public entity has the same amount of data, same exact thing, they can hire like same people.
But
to
maybe
do
that's
same
the
exact thing.
assumption, like we're not buying, that they would
Yeah,
actually
that's
have
what I
this,
think. That's what.
right?
Yeah, I mean,
that's
I think
the
it's
difference is.
possible for the government to have the same amount of data, but I think if you change the way the market works, then the data doesn't exist anymore. You know what I
You
mean?
could have like in China where like you said before, that they got the companies share all their data with the government, and you can have the government can be run by 3 supercomputers like in Evangelion, and you can they use all the data that's provided by these companies and things, and they set up everything.
Well, again, there's the problem of if you're designing everything from the top down, then you're not getting any data anymore. So there's this conflict between the the supercomputers would have to literally simulate the entire market in order to
But what do you think market does right now?
the market is already a giant supercomputer, so you basically have to recreate that supercomputer. You have to recreate the market, but the market itself already has supercomputers involved in
You
it,
still have
right?
a market.
It has these,
Yeah. The market,
The
still
market
exists,
hasn't.
even
The
if the government
consumer
is
side of the market
yeah.
hasn't changed. Only the supplier side has changed.
It's like saying,
So
Oh, I
people
see.
are
So
still
you're
going
saying-
and buying things and
So
stuff?
you're saying that people's purchasing decisions they're still making their own purchasing decisions on what to buy and everything like that, and
And the three
You're still
supercomputer-
operating freely as a consumer.
And you still
you're-
have,
right.
like-
The consumers are still
Ownership
making
of
yeah.
it.
And
And
you
those
just
three
have to make
supercomputers
this
can be
green
charged as separate things. Like one could be for the environment, and the other one could be for humans, like health and things like that. And the other one could be for like consumer driven, like how the resources can be used to produce computers or pants or medical supplies or beer or something.
So Jared, I think I understand what you're saying, which is that the consumer behavior is still going to be the same, so you're still going to be able to collect all that data and respond to that data.
right.
Go ahead, Madeleine.
Okay. I just want to get back to the
Yeah, no, that's
Yeah,
fine.
right.
one thing, and before we have to stop, I have a problem with the side of monopolies that we haven't really addressed,
Yeah.
which is that they control a lot of assets in our society. They control land and, data. So, what would a UBI change in that respect? Would we have more access to assets, or would it just be money that what would it do in terms of today's topic?
Yeah.
Because monopolies are not just, they're not just about money, they're about a lot of other things in society that they control.
So basic income gives people access to the production, to the output of these companies. I don't think it does really anything with respect to the ownership of assets, the ownership of productive capital, that kind of stuff.
Well, isn't that a problem?
I don't know, is it?
I think so, because if you don't share, if that's what they're all mostly about, assets.
That's what the monopolies are
monopolies.
mostly about. Yeah.
Then if there's no vehicle to change that formula, then what is the
So
point
the
of
question is
UBI?
why do you want to change that formula? Is the danger that the centralized control may be used inappropriately for people, or
No, it's just
Yeah.
that a lot of stuff in the world is not theirs. It's ours. It's everybody's. The land, for instance, there used to be a concept that the land is everybody's until,
Thomas
many
Paine.
huge companies decided that they would own it.
so you think that people don't have enough access to land?
Well, for one thing, that's. I mean, I don't mean that they need to own the land, but maybe
would it
they
be
could.
fair to say that your concern here is that you think people won't have as much power over their lives, and that that power over them could be exploited? Is that sort of what you're
No,
saying?
what
or-
I'm saying is that if they don't need to per se own the land, but maybe they could share in the profits that what you call it, that asset produces.
I guess I don't think either of us is necessarily disagreeing with you. I think we're trying to establish what the thesis is, what the you're proposing this as a problem. Can you explain why what you're saying is a problem is a problem?
I know Thomas Paine, Agrarian Justice, that everyone, this is their, in millennia ago, everyone could walk across the land with, as they pleased. They could pick forage for food and whatnot, and hunter-gatherers and things like that. And suddenly someone decided, oh, I'm going to put fences along this property and this is going to be mine. And
I gotta say, all of this is pretty much wrong in the sense that even animals have territoriality in the sense of ownership. And they decide it based on like who gets there first a lot of the time to avoid like costly fights. And humans have a sense of some property for a really long time. Before agriculture, you didn't have as much storable property, so you didn't have as many societies with lopsided ownership in that sense. But whatever you could own sometimes would be owned. And they would have different rules about borrowing or stealing and this kind of stuff.
I
So
was going to say, I can only imagine that, like, the earliest humans, probably the first fight anyone ever had was over land.
Yeah,
like,
or
Alex,
objects of some
Sorry
sort.
to
Yeah.
interrupt. I can give you one example of
Yeah.
shared asset. The UBI that they have in Alaska, they share the revenues of their oil. Correct?
That's what we're going to do next week.
Yeah, we're going to talk
So
about Alaska.
that's an example of shared assets.
So, yeah, but I mean, so certainly in Alaska, you know, the story is that, you know, the state of Alaska is selling this oil, and then those revenues are coming in and they're being distributed to the people. But the thing is, the people are getting the money, and the benefit that they get is not. It has nothing to do with the fact that some oil was sold somewhere. It has to do with the fact that they got this money and they can spend this money, right? So
I think from a certain point of
Yeah.
from a certain point of view, Alex just sees the entire productive capacity of the economy as the thing that he wants people to share in, and so
Right.
like he wants to give people enough money that they're taking maximum advantage of the entire productive capacity of the economy. So
Right.
you know, you could think of that as like a shared asset, but
Right.
depending on what that
So
means.
I think by giving people money to spend to take part in the productive potential of the economy, everyone's sharing the assets of the economy because they're getting the
I don't know if that
the
lines up
benefit
to how
from
you
that.
So
Yeah.
maybe we're saying the same thing, but
Maybe.
I was trying to understand the difference between a basic income, which is just cash,
Yeah.
or a share of the assets of us, of the
Again,
country.
So it's-
in that case, I
the
guess what
economic-
she's
the-
describing is it's like in terms of basic income. Let's say everybody has basic income.
Yeah.
Eventually, it will come down to like wealth gap instead of income gap, right? Because markets still exist, people are still making money. Technically, markets decide whoever gets paid what, but then those markets are still monopolies. So monopolies decide who makes what. Right?
Yeah.
To some extent, so it still comes down to the same problem, and it becomes
And what's the problem?
the problem there would again be like the wealth gap. I would say it's in this terms of there's nothing wrong with it, but if one person owns the entire country,
Well, I think what you're arguing is that there's like the disadvantage of having a monopoly is primarily that people are unable to buy things, and if there was a UBI, that's not really a problem.
Well, there's other disadvantages
Yeah.
of monopolies too, like the lack of incentive to have better quality, right, or better prices, I guess. Too.
Well, it depends on how you're establishing your monopoly. If you're establishing your monopoly by just being better than anyone else could be and more efficient than anyone else could be,
And there's a possibility that someone else could enter the market.
yes, that's what
Right.
I was saying,
Yeah, that's
like
that's
the
what
ideal, right?
incentive
Yeah.
of a monopoly is.
Right.
That's basically what it'll come down to, and even after that, there still would be like you would want to have the decision making. It also depends on that, just because if there's who's making the decisions there.
yeah.
Because that is another, I would say, source of power, especially if it's a monopoly.
Yeah. I think there's always a risk anytime you have kind of like a single point of control or a single point of failure. And if you're in a system where you need these kinds of centralized monopolies, you have to decide. I mean, sometimes you do want redundancy, you do want competition, even though it's more wasteful of resources because it helps protect the robustness of the economy of the markets of that kind of
Yeah,
thing.
I guess that's another disadvantage. In addition to lack of incentive potentially to do a good job, there's also like fragility. Is that kind of what you're
Yeah,
pointing out? Like
yeah.
if you only have one point, so if that fails, everybody's kind of in trouble.
And I would say the lack of incentive to do a good job is kind of it's one aspect of this fragility, of one aspect of, okay, now the efficient system is breaking down because of this.
I guess I think of
Yeah.
them as separate, and maybe you're just seeing
Yeah.
it more deeply than I am, but it seems like one is like something could just go wrong. Like the company has no incentive for that thing to go wrong, but like there's just like a breakdown in the servers or something, and you don't have anyone to go. There's no like ready sort of business that can step up or like handle
Yeah.
the problem, or you don't have any fallback basically. Whereas the other seems like an incentive problem on the human level. Like people no longer are trying to outcompete another company, and so they're not necessarily competing on quality, competing on price, just as an everyday kind of thing.
I think we're both saying the same thing. We're just framing it differently.
Okay, that might be.
Like I would just frame the incentive problem as a breakdown in the efficiency. It's part of what there's risk that the incentive problem is going to happen, right?
Some
Or-
say inevitability, but
Yeah.
yeah.
Inevitability. Yeah, I mean it's true. I mean it's not like just a random
Right.
happenstance. I guess that's the main point you're making.
Yeah,
is that
exactly,
it's the incentives are going to lead to this.
Yeah,
Or
yeah.
the lack of
It's more
incentive to be
predictable. It's
efficient, to
predictable.
remain efficient and to compete. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I want to get back to Madeleine's
Yeah, sorry,
question
Madeline, we got on.
about the question you asked was what's the difference between giving people cash and shared assets?
Right.
Right.
And I think the only difference is in how you frame it. So, we could frame the Alaska oil dividend as a shared asset because everyone's kind of sharing in the oil profits, or you could frame it as just giving people cash.
Right.
And they're really both the same thing. And if you look at basic income, a more generalized basic income, the shared asset is just all of the economy's production, or the productive capacity is now a shared asset. Does that make sense?
So it includes public land and air and data.
Well, I think
and-
the idea is that all of these things are, at least in theory, exchangeable for money. So depending
Right.
on how big the UBI is,
Yes.
like if I was in Alaska, if I really wanted to and they paid me my check, I could immediately go and buy oil from the state
Yeah.
for it and just demand my oil in the form of oil.
Right.
Right.
Like
Yeah.
in kind, maybe.
Although,
Right.
if you do share the assets per se, then you might have more control over what happens to it.
Yeah. So I think
You know-
this is the issue with monopolies, that there's control over how the assets are being used and that kind of stuff. But certainly, Jared brought up the point that you could buy the asset directly if you wanted to with your money, assuming the markets are functioning properly. And I think the reality is that most people are not particularly interested in managing their own capital and controlling a slice of the production or something like that. They're happy to leave that up to the specialists, and certain industries and certain companies are gonna be really good at getting the most out of the data that Amazon collected or something like that. And then like Joe on the street, he's not. I mean, like you give him the data, he's gonna be like, why? What am I doing with this, right? It's. Yeah, so I think that's the big thing, is that
You can have like a carbon dividend as well. That's another thing. Or
Right.
like California proposed the data dividend, where they put it into like a sovereign wealth kind of thing, and then they give out dividends per.
So Andrew,
Yeah, so these
Andrew
are-
Yang uses this like framing also. It like just calls the basic income a freedom dividend.
Right.
But I think I agree with Alex that it's kind of a framing issue, because all of these are sort of like ways to justify giving people the money. And from
Right.
Alex's perspective, like the entire productive capacity of the economy is what justifies giving the money and sets the amount of money. And so you could frame it as a dividend of the whole sort of.
right.
all
I would
of
say
them.
most of this is just moral justification. It doesn't change kind of the economics and why it's good. It's good because it benefits people. It's good because people can, be richer and more prosperous, right? So, yeah.
I have one other.
Yeah, go ahead.
So what if you, let's see, what about sharing the investment asset in a society? Let's say you give every person that is born $50 and they would invest it until they have to go to college.
Oh, that's a baby
bond.
Baby bond. That's it.
So that's another form of an asset that most people don't share.
So I guess
in
it's
society.
an interesting question whether you'd want to do that or just give them that expected value at 18,
Right.
like which might be less risky for them.
Or a question is, do you want to give people $50 to invest when they're born, or do you just so like Bethany was
And like they vest it till they're 18 and they get $500 or whatever,
Yeah.
or just give them $500
or do you
when they're
instead
18.
of the investment, maybe you just give them the money that they would have made from the investment when they're
Right.
older. Or I
Right.
mean, like it's just kind of like different
That
ways
seems
of
less
justifying. the
like
same
that would
thing.
seem more
Yeah.
stable to me, because what if they invested and it doesn't go well, or you know.
I think a lot of these questions come from the idea of people are worried about where the money is going to come from.
Right.
So they're thinking, okay, we know we can afford to, set aside these baby bonds for $50 that will, gain value in the markets over time. This might be, like that's a way to get the money to the people. But if you're looking at the economy from the perspective of, okay, there's a certain amount of productive capacity, there's a certain amount of room for consumer spending that the economy will productively respond to, then what matters isn't where you got the money from. What matters is that once they have the money, that the economy is going to be able to produce something for them to buy. Because if it's not, if the economy is not able to produce at a level that matches the level of consumer spending, then you have inflation, and you don't want that. And it's the same thing with Social Security, for example. There was a quote we played a couple months ago, I think, in here, where it had Alan Greenspan talking about Social Security. And, the idea is that when people get their Social Security checks, what matters is that the economy is able to accommodate that spending. It doesn't matter, where that money came from or whether there's enough money in the fund or something. What matters is that, once, even if you funded it perfectly, if we didn't have the productive capacity to respond to that spending, then you can't give them the money because there's no room for it in the economy.
Modern money theories with the Alan Greenspan.
Yeah, right. So we're getting towards the end.
Time for a go around.
Let's go around and get some final thoughts from people. Bethany, go ahead.
What are any particular topic or just
Basic income, monopolies, anything we've talked about today. It was kind of wide ranging. Yeah.
Cool. I guess I still feel like I don't have a perfect answer to the original question, which is like, at what point did the sort of benefits and costs of monopoly outweigh benefits and costs of competition? And like, if the benefits and costs sort of tip towards monopoly, what do you do about the downsides, about the fact that you might not have an incentive to have good quality for consumers, the fact that you might have these sort of fragility issues where you could have something go wrong, that's a big problem. So I feel like we never really answered that, which is kind of unfortunate because I kind of want to know, but there might not be a perfect answer. It might be case by case. I guess the dream is like all the efficiency of a monopoly with a really easy low bar to entry. So like as soon as they screw up, they're done. So they kind of have like the incentive in that way without redundancy, but that may not be practical for a lot of the reasons that many people brought up. In many cases, it's just not possible to have a low barrier to entry with something like that. So,
yeah.
Anyway, that's my.
Okay, Madeleine.
Well, I still try to get my head around this problem of, invest. If you invest, you don't need a lot of money to invest, but you need a lot of money to give a person when they have to start to go to college. So wouldn't one be more efficient than the other?
I think the assumption is that money's being invested in absentia before you're given it. Like the same money is still there, right? Or sorry, we're going around it. I shouldn't be commenting.
We're going around.
Right.
Yeah.
So you're saying it would not be better?
Yeah. I'm saying in either case, what matters isn't how much money you put into it. What matters is when you get the money out, are people going to have something to spend it on? Does the economy have the capacity to respond to that spending? And if it does, you can just print money. Pablo.
Yeah, so I think my final thoughts on the data monopoly would be that, like, when you define perfect competition, you say that all the suppliers have, all the people have like the perfect information, the perfect, the price is similar. But here now we're saying like the company has the information. It's inverse actually. The company has all the information on people. It has all the information on customers. Customers, on the other hand, are sort of like at disadvantage over this, but at the same time, Amazon is also striving to create like a perfect economy, like perfect marketplace in its own sense. So I think there are some things we need to look at, and the government definitely needs to explore regulating data and how they combine the data.
Yeah. Rodrigo.
Yes, I think I have a lot of questions right now. Right?
All right.
A lot of final thoughts. I think this is sorry.
Cool.
You could end with some questions if you want. If you want to just throw some things out there.
Some questions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess one question is definitely how can we regulate those big corporations And another question is, how can we make sure that the benefits that we get out of like a monopoly and are bigger than the what we're giving up, you know?
Yeah. Okay, Sultan.
I will pass.
Okay, George.
Monopolies kill technological development. Point number one. Now, monopolies versus market, free market. Sometimes one approach works better, sometimes the other one approach works better. So the solutions should be somewhere in combining both somehow. And the last thing that we didn't touch, and Galbraith wrote about that 50 years ago. Corporations do not work for their shareholders, not for their, so to say, owners. He very clearly explained why. Corporations work for their managers, and it's a totally different story. As a result, they may be growing like a cancer, like a tumor, because they are not interested as much in expanding production or technological development. They rather are interested in developing new positions for themselves. That's it for now.
Okay, Nick.
Interesting discussion.
Okay, Richard.
Well, like I was saying in the beginning, you need to change the political system in order to better manage the monopolies and maybe split them up, or otherwise you're not going to get anywhere, because they're just going to, like they were saying in the video, we go through a change of, like in the Gilded Age where you create monopolies, and then with Roosevelt through, well, the second Roosevelt, where you split them up, and then now for the past like 40 years we've been creating them again, and so eventually people are going to get fed up, and then they're going to split them apart, and they're just going to go through these cycles until capitalism implodes or whatever.
Okay, Jared.
Looking forward to seeing capitalism in Florida. My syllogism I'd like to end on is the idea that everything is a natural monopoly, that there is no distinction, that everything is more efficient if centralized in some sense, and that a natural monopoly should be a monopoly, and a monopoly should probably be public. Ergo, I would say everything should be public.
Okay. Okay. Yeah.
Price elasticity of demand and basic income and monopolies. How did it not come up?
Ah, shit.
I don't know. There's a lot of stuff.
Just the course in there.
So.
Price elasticity of demand.
So.
I was trying to give you things you could talk about.
So yeah, I think the main thing that's kind of gonna stick with me from this is Richard and Jared's point about being able to just centrally manage the entire supply side of the markets, and whether that could be efficient, whether you could still have the same level of innovation and dynamism and everything. I mean, certainly people are always going to be trying to come up with ways to make money, and people are always going to be coming up with ways to pay people to do things for each other. But maybe it gets to a point where you see that something's beneficial, some product is beneficial or something like that, once it reaches a certain threshold, and the government just takes over from there or something like that. I don't know. I have to think about that. I was initially very skeptical, and I'm still very skeptical, and I'm going to be chewing on that. So that's my final thought. And
Does
yeah,
Jacqueline have a final
lots of interesting comments on the live chat. I would encourage, if you're watching this video in an embedded form, I would encourage you to open it up in YouTube so you can see the live chat as we go.
Thanks, Jacqueline. And
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah. Thanks, Alex. Thanks, everyone. Yeah, I just realized that going around that we never